The Miami International Autodrome gets a really bad reputation, but I kind of like it. And by the looks of things, so does Max Verstappen, getting, as he did, his second pole position of 2025. And again, it was an unlikely pole because the McLarens looked like they had it all wrapped up. So how did Max Verstappen nick another pole position off the papaya cars? We're going to have a look. And as we go through, I want you to try and think about the dichotomy that there is in that McLaren. Are the drivers scared to reach that limit? Or is it that they're complacent and they think the car just has inherent pace that will bail them out of difficult situations? Here we go. So Max made a mistake on his first corner. Didn't bail out of it, went for it, but there was definitely a mistake. Here he is going into corner one. Steering wheel is pointing to the left. Corner is going to the right. He had a little oversteer moment, and it definitely did cost him time. These are the overlays of his Q3 runs. The first run in white and his second run in blue. Now he attacks the corner similarly in both instances, but you can see that in the second run, the blue run, he picks up the throttle much later, and I think that then costs him time as he heads into turn 2 and 3. So there was definitely a mistake there, but he overcomes it, and I'll show you how that happens. So this is sector 1 of the Miami International Autodrome, Verstappen versus Norris, a combo that I think we're going to get used to over the course of this season. As usual, Verstappen's in blue, Norris is in papaya, orange, whatever you want to call it. And what I want to do is bring your attention first of all to that speed trace. Look how much quicker Max approaches the first corner. You can see that in the throttle and brake traces down below, where Max appreciably brakes later into that corner. And this, for me, is a fundamental of how he goes about racing this particular sector. So although he loses a bit of time ultimately in this corner because he picks up the throttle later because he's had that mistake, actually the way that he approaches it is super aggressive. He brakes super late. There's a little bit of an overlap between the throttle and the brake on the entry to the corner, whereas Lando is much more conservative, braking and coming off throttle much earlier. That mistake from Verstappen allows Lando to pick up the throttle a bit earlier and gives him a slightly better exit going through to the tricky bits of this sector. And you can see that again in the speed trace, especially in the early part of that corner, of that exit, that his speed is slightly better. Then we get into the tricky bit of the sector. So this is the turn 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 section where the drivers are going through these fast sweepers, and they are technical. It's not a case of just putting your foot down and allowing the car to go. And you can see that into turn 4, this is turn 4 here, Max maintains a higher minimum speed, and he does that pretty obviously by just not coming off the throttle quite as much, but it's so marked. When you actually have a look at this, Max has 82% throttle versus Lando, who only has 31%. There's a lot of conservatism or fear in the way that Lando approaches that corner. He's come right off the throttle to less than half, and he's just not carrying the same amount of speed as a result. And then into turn 5, Max has a stab of the brakes as he turns the car to the right. And in previous videos, I would have said that, you know, the driver that hits the brakes doesn't have confidence in their car. But actually, this, I think, is a pattern coming through Formula 1 2025, which is that drivers are using the brakes and the throttle simultaneously to just get the car rotated quicker so that they can then get the car straight quicker so they can then power down the next straight. And Max does that here, whereas Lando relies much more on just coming off the throttle to stabilize the car. And you'll see, you know that in a road car, if you come off the throttle, it will tuck the front of the car in, and I think that becomes much more aggressive if you're on the brakes as well. That is what Max is doing here. It's beautiful to watch it, and again that pays him back in a higher minimum speed. And finally we go into the turn 7, 8 complex. So this is the hardest bit of this sector, I think, which is where the track moves to the left, turns to the left, and it in a tightening left-hander, and again, there's a difference in the way that these two approach this corner. Max does brake early, he does come off the throttle early, he's on the brakes for longer. But again, I think he's doing that to balance the car again, to get it rotated into the corner quicker so that he can get the car straight again earlier. And that does pay him back with a slightly better exit. I think you can see that here, that going down the next straight, he actually does get a better exit. That's going to pay him back when we get into turn 11, which I'll show you in a second. Lando, by comparison, and this is for me the main point at which I think that the McLaren drivers, and Lando especially here, is being super conservative. Look at the gap between him coming off the throttle and then hitting the brakes, and again coming off the brakes and then getting back on the throttle again. He's just not happy that the rear end of the car has stuck. Now, whether it has or not, I don't know. And in previous qualifying attempts, before Jeddah, where he crashed in the wall, would he have just picked up the throttle earlier and just trusted that the back end would stick? I think he just doesn't trust it right now. Sector 2. So Sector 2, I think, is where Lando essentially gets his payback, and you can see that in the delta as we go across. Max, with that ridiculous exit out of turn 8, approaches turn 11 with a huge delta. He brakes much later, comes off the throttle much later than Lando does. But from there on in, the trend of the delta is that it comes back down in Lando's favour. And you can see on the speed trace that, you know, overall, Lando maintains a higher minimum speed and is picking up the throttle and braking a bit earlier than Max is, ultimately leading to him having this exit. Picks up the throttle so much earlier in turn 16 with the speed trace. It's just night and day between Max and Lando. And this is where I think Lando might have got a bit complacent in Sector 1. He knows that the Red Bull is mighty through the medium and high-speed corners, especially in Max's hands, where Max has a car that will allow him to attack those corners, but he also trusts the rear end, or is able to live with a rear end that's a bit more floaty. But this is where the McLaren will really show its strength in low speed corners. It will maintain its tyre temperature, giving Lando the turn in he wants and the exit in traction zones that he wants. And that's how he gets this incredible exit. And you can see that by the end of this sector, the delta is coming right down. And Lando is getting closer and closer. So why doesn't he get pole? Ultimately, it's because of his final corner. And again, Max is absolutely banzai into that final corner. He's got a huge speed differential. He brakes super late. But I don't know if this is Max braking super late or Lando just braking too early. You have a massive spike of the delta here. And Lando, despite picking up the throttle earlier and more aggressively and bringing that delta down, can't make up for the fact that he brakes so much earlier in the first place and ends up just a couple of hundredths behind. So it's a lap of 3 sectors, really, as they all are. I know that sounds silly, but the Red Bull was absolutely in its element in Sector 1. The McLaren was absolutely in its element in Sector 2, and it was a difference in the way that the drivers approached the final corner that ultimately decided it, and that was down to driver. But could the McLaren have got more out of Sector 1? We're going to have a little look at Oscar versus Kimi now. Kimi was a revelation of qualifying, and I want to show you, hopefully, some of the parallels between the way that Oscar and Lando are approaching Sector 1. So again, yes, Kimi got sprint qualifying pole, but the Mercedes isn't fundamentally a quicker car than the McLaren. We know that through the rest of the qualifying sessions, Q1, Q2, Q3. But have a little look at how Oscar attacks this sector versus Kimi. So Kimi again does a max. He bowls in hard, brakes super late, comes off the throttle late, much later than Oscar does anyway. And you can see again he's playing with the throttle and the brake on the way into the corner, whereas Oscar, especially on the way in, there's a bit of a gap between coming off throttle and hitting the brake. He's much more conservative into that first corner. He does pick up the throttle a bit early, and that early corner aggression from Kimi, although it gives him a better minimum speed, doesn't give him the same exit, and Oscar actually has a better exit coming out of turn 1 and 2. You can see that in the delta, which is slightly in Oscar's favour here. But then we get into the difficult bits of this turns 4, 5 to 8. And you can see again here that Kimi just trusts that rear end of his Mercedes a bit more. Maybe like Max, he just has a better feeling for the rear end. Or maybe Oscar again knows what happened to Lando in Jeddah could happen to him, so he just backs off that limit a little bit more, comes off the throttle more, but then loses a bit in minimum speed. And again into turn 5, when they go into that right-hander, this time Oscar does try and get the car turned in a bit harder with the brakes, but he's not as aggressive with it as Kimi is. And again, the delta starts to show, and you can see how it's starting to creep up, and it's really 7 and 8. This is where Kimi really has the magic, and you can see here that, look, he comes off the throttle and the brake almost simultaneously, just overlapping the brake and the throttle into the corner. He brakes for a bit longer, but especially on the exit, look at this overlap. He's still balancing the car to get it as straight as possible, as early as he can. He picks up the throttle super early and he just bang straight out of that corner and up the next straight. Oscar, by comparison, has another little bit of a gap between coming off the brakes and hitting the throttle, and again I think he has a bit of a moment or rides the curb a bit too much on the exit, and there's a step in his throttle application here which costs him, I think, going up the next straight. So look, Max did his special again. You know, Max is always going to bring something a bit extra, and around a track like Miami where it is technical, where it does reward bravery, especially in that first sector, he was always going to do well. But looking at both of these McLaren traces, you can see that there's a pattern emerging, and Lando's converging much more towards what Oscar has been doing. Maybe that's what he's learned in the simulator, that going after the final tenth of performance in this 8 or 9 tenths car isn't helping him. Actually, it causes more problems than it solves, and maybe we don't need to do that. We can just rely on the ultimate pace of this car to get us the qualifying result we need. It's just that it's not a very Formula One way of going about it, is it? It's not about chasing the last hundreds, going after the last millimetre of performance, and it opens them up to these kind of performances from other drivers like Kimi, like Max. That means that they will get out qualified every now and again. Is there a way around that? I don't know. Is it safer to just rely on the car's performance? Right now it seems like it probably is, but ultimately that's why Max Verstappen got pole position. I think he was able to reach that limit, reach the outer envelope of what his car can do much more readily than his McLaren drivers were either able to do or were willing to do. And there you go. As usual, please like, please subscribe, please leave us a comment. We'll read every single one. We'll reply to as many as we possibly can, and we will see you guys in the next one.